Hi everyone, before we get into it, please hit the subscribe button and drop a like. It helps me out a lot and contributes a lot to the channel. Now let's get into it. I hope you enjoy. A gentle wind swept through the dense pine forest surrounding the Silvercrest Pack's territory. The moon hung low in the sky, bathing the glades and tree trunks in its silver light. Alara, the young she-wolf who had only recently completed her first shift, felt exhilaration coursing through her as she and her fellow packmates gathered beneath the bright moon. The night air was filled with energy, and every wolf in the pack could sense it. Although no one had named the sensation, there was a collective awareness that something would soon disturb the long-standing peace that their alpha, Kieran, had worked so hard to maintain. Alara stood at the edge of a small clearing, the pine needles soft beneath her bare feet. Her shimmering hazel eyes swept across the circle of wolves who had assembled there, each one quietly vigilant. She noticed the tension in their postures, the careful way in which they guarded their surroundings, as though expecting a threat to emerge from the darkness at any moment. Yet the Silvercrest Pack's borders had been secure for years, upheld by strong alliances with neighboring clans and by Kieran's unwavering leadership. Nevertheless, an undercurrent of unease wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of the forest and the faint hint of distant streams. Kieran stood in front of them all, a tall figure with broad shoulders and an air of calm authority that radiated through every gesture. His midnight black hair caught the silvery light of the moon, and his sharp blue eyes scanned the assembly. Beside him, his beta, Jared, kept a vigilant stance, arms crossed over a muscular chest, as though daring the night to challenge their stronghold. Despite the unspoken anxiety stirring in the group, no one could have predicted the abrupt turn that this night would take. Alara, like the others, sensed the unsettled hush as the clouds began to part, revealing the moon in its full brilliance. She could feel her own instincts sharpening, her senses tingling, as if the primal part of her nature was warning her of danger. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop, a crisp bite in the air that did not come from the simple approach of midnight, but from a darker, more potent force lurking at the edges of reason. Suddenly, an unmistakable cry shattered the hush. It came from one of the outer watchposts, echoing in the stillness like a jagged strike of lightning. A scout raced forward, eyes wide and adrenaline surging through his veins, shouting a single word that froze every wolf in place. Shadowfang. The word carried an ominous weight, like a specter from the darkest nightmares of the werewolf realm. Everyone knew of the Shadowfang Pack's destructive nature, their love for conflict, and their relentless pursuit of dominance. But the notion that the Shadowfang wolves would dare launch a direct attack against Silvercrest, especially on a night as sacred as the cusp of the blood moon, was unthinkable. Before Alara could fully absorb the scout's warning, a swarm of dark shapes burst forth from the nearby tree line. Growls, snarls, and furious cries filled the air, intermingling with the clash of bodies. The forest erupted into chaos as Shadowfang warriors, their eyes blazing with feral intensity, lunged straight into the heart of the Silvercrest territory. Kieran roared a command to defend, his voice steeped in resolve. Instantly, the clearing was brimming with fur and fangs as wolves transformed to repel the sudden onslaught. Alara's heart pounded wildly, fear and the instinct to survive rushing through her. She fought her rising terror, repelling her training and the unity of her pack. Turning quickly, she prepared to back up Jared, who was brawling with one of the intruders. The noise of the fight was tremendous, as howls and snarls echoed amid the towering pines. Amid the swirling conflict, Ilara glimpsed Kieran engaged in a savage collision with two Shadowfang fighters. Despite the overwhelming numbers, he held firm, his strength and cunning surpassing that of ordinary wolves. She tried to focus, searching for any sign that her packmates required aid, but the darkness conspired against her. A growl sounded from her left, and she spun just in time to dodge an attack by a hulking Shadowfang wolf. She swiftly dropped to the ground and kicked out, momentarily catching her assailant off balance. The wolf bared its teeth, poised to renew its assault, only to recoil when another Silvercrest wolf tackled it from the side. All around her, the chaos escalated, intensifying the primal terror that pulsed in her veins. The cloying smell of blood saturated the air, and Ilara's normally steady spirit flickered with uncertainty. Yet just as she steeled her resolve to continue fighting, her attention was torn away by a terrifying presence pushing its way through the fray. The Shadowfang Alpha, Nikolai, was making his way straight toward the center of the clearing, his massive form radiating dark authority that sent a chill through even the most stalwart fighters. Nikolai was widely recognized for his ruthless leadership and unwavering thirst for power. The sight of him was enough to make any pack warrior question their courage, and in that split second, the momentum of the battle shifted. With supernatural grace, he avoided a blow from Jared, then seized the beta by the throat and threw him aside, declaring his dominance with a snarl that seemed to reverberate through the forest. As his merciless gaze moved across the clearing, it landed on Ilara. She felt her blood run cold and her heart hammer in her chest, although she could not have explained why. There was something strangely compelling in his eyes, an energy so foreign that her instincts screamed at her to run. She crouched in a defensive stance, each muscle tensed for fight or flight, but Nikolai did not immediately charge at her. Instead, he regarded her with keen interest. Ilara had known fear before. She had faced adversaries in training, had endured hunts where the line between prey and predator blurred, but she had never encountered anything like the piercing stare of a rival alpha whose power seemed to wrap around her like inescapable chains. A savage grin spread across Nikolai's face, and he moved with chilling certainty. The moment he extended a hand to her, Ilara felt an inexplicable shock coursing through her. It was not purely fear or the adrenaline of combat, but something else entirely, something that felt like the raw energy of a fated bond. She recoiled, refusing to believe that she, a loyal member of the Silvercrest Pack, might share any kind of bond with the menacing Shadowfang Alpha. Around them, the fight continued in chaotic waves, but it felt as though a bubble had formed around Nikolai and Ilara. Kieran, engaged in fending off 3 Shadowfang wolves, locked eyes with Ilara from across the clearing. He caught the way Nikolai seized her wrist and yanked her near, though she struggled and growled in defiance. Seeing her immediate danger, Kieran roared her name and attempted to push through his opponents, but the Shadowfang wolves converged on him more aggressively, forming an impenetrable barrier. The fear pulsing through Ilara was matched only by the sheer disbelief coursing through her. She was loyal to her pack, and she had never encountered anything to make her question that loyalty. Even in the heat of battle, she felt an unspoken respect for Kieran, her alpha, who had led them with fairness and courage. Yet now, here was this formidable stranger, Nikolai, whose aura threatened to overwhelm her senses, whispering promises of a bond that defied reason. She kicked, twisted, and attempted to break free from Nikolai's iron-like grip, but he held fast. His powerful arms were unyielding, and she felt his hot breath near her ear as he spoke with a voice that cut through her defenses. "You are mine, little wolf. The raw determination in his tone made her wolf instincts tremble, as though some primal chord had been struck. Wrenching her head around, Ilara bared her teeth at him, refusing to yield. She was frantic to escape, desperate to rejoin Kieran, who was only a short distance away, but might as well have been on another continent, thanks to the vicious onslaught by the other Shadowfang wolves. As Nikolai tightened his hold, he barked orders to his pack, and they began a calculated retreat, dragging her along with them. Ilara howled, her voice laced with raw terror, hoping her pack would somehow intervene. Kieran, locked in his own deadly struggle, roared with frustration as he witnessed her being taken. He managed to throw one opponent off and lunged forward, but the treacherous swirl of Shadowfang wolves prevented him from closing the distance. Ilara fought with every ounce of will she possessed, but her captors were too many, and Nikolai's power weighed upon her like a living force. Each time she clawed or snapped at him, he tightened his hold until she could barely breathe. Her vision swam, and her limbs grew heavy. The last thing she saw before blackness claimed her was the sight of Kieran being held back by the unrelenting circle of enemies, his eyes filled with rage and anguish, a silent plea for her to hold on. When she slipped into unconsciousness, the forest was still raging with snarls, the air still thick with the smell of blood, and her last coherent thought was that nothing would ever be the same again. She did not realize how very right she was. Morning light greeted the devastated Silvercrest clearing, revealing the scars of the previous night's battle. Burned-out campfires, scattered weapons, and torn earth told the story of sudden violence. Many wolves, including Kieran himself, had sustained wounds. Although none of those wounds were fatal, they stung the heart of the pack nonetheless. They were fresh proof of the threat that the Shadowfang Pack posed, a threat no longer held at bay by treaties or unspoken boundaries. Kieran paced restlessly along the clearing, scanning the forest as though Ilara might reappear at any moment. Regret weighed heavily on him, and he silently berated himself for not anticipating the attack. How had the Shadowfang Pack managed to cross the borders undetected? How had Nikolai known when and where to strike? Jared, sporting a bruised jaw and a laceration across one bicep, approached cautiously. Alpha, we have scoured the perimeter. No sign of her. The scent trail is there, though, which means we can track them, but they've covered their tracks well. We suspect they used the creek to mask some of their scent. Kieran's brows pinched in worry, but his resolve was unwavering. Organize search teams. We start immediately. There's no time to waste. Ilara must be found before the next blood moon rises. As he issued orders, a fearful hush fell over the remaining members of the pack. They were well aware of the blood moon's significance. While any full moon heightened their senses and tested their control, the blood moon bore a power that could forge unbreakable bonds and seal destinies. Stories abounded of fated mates discovered under its crimson glow, ties that could unite packs or drive them to ruin. The notion that Nikolai intended to claim Ilara under such circumstances was almost too terrible to contemplate. Kieran steeled himself, pushing aside the confusion and dread gnawing at his heart. The pack needed him to lead, to remain strong. He never voiced the guilt he felt, how it burned inside him that he had failed to protect one of his own, and he certainly did not mention the hint of something else. Jealousy. Even though it made no logical sense, a part of him despised the idea that Nikolai might be Ilara's fated mate. He tried to dismiss the irrational pang that lodged in his chest, determined to remember the duty he owed to the entire pack. The moment the search parties were sent out, the atmosphere shifted from shock to determination. Wolves at every rank volunteered to comb the woods, to gather intel from distant territories, and to patrol the borders day and night. Everyone realized that a grave offense had been committed, and that they could not allow it to go unanswered. Kieran's face was set like stone, his entire being coiled with the need to make this right. Somewhere in the deepest recesses of the forest, far beyond Silvercrest's border, Ilara woke in a place she did not recognize. The damp smell of moss and stone assaulted her senses. Her head felt heavy and disoriented as she blinked to clear her vision, only to realize she was in a makeshift holding cell within the Shadowfang Pack's underground lair. Torchlight cast flickering shadows across the rough-hewn rock walls, amplifying the claustrophobic feel of the space. She attempted to stand, only to groan in pain as her muscles protested. The memory of the battle flooded back in disjointed fragments, Nikolai's chilling presence, the struggle, the feeling of utter helplessness when she was dragged away. Despite the raw fear simmering in her veins, her first coherent thought was for her pack. She wondered if Kieran and Jared were all right. She prayed that her packmates had survived, that they had not been annihilated by the invaders. Her second thought was far more unsettling. She remembered Nikolai's electric touch, the inexplicable sensation that coursed through her, as though tying her essence to his. She shuddered, repulsed by the notion, and she refused to believe that the universe could be so twisted as to pair her with someone whose cruelty was legendary. Her jailer approached, sliding open the heavy metal bar that secured the cell door. Two large men stepped inside, each radiating hostility. They grabbed her arms, dragging her out into the corridor. Ilara tried to fight, but the lingering weakness from last night sapped her strength. Though she put up as much resistance as she could manage, it wasn't enough to stop them. They brought her before Nikolai, who awaited her in what appeared to be a primitive throne room carved into the rocks. Furs were draped over stone seats, and the Shadowfang insignia was etched into the walls. He was seated on a large elevated chair, surrounded by his top warriors, many of whom bore the scars of countless conflicts. When Ilara was forced to kneel at his feet, she clenched her jaw to stifle the unbidden rage that boiled in her gut. Nikolai observed her with an unsettling calm, his dark eyes revealing neither pity nor mercy. He rose from his seat, moving closer to her, and she caught the faint scent of pine and smoke emanating from him. The tension in the room coiled tight, as though every wolf there could sense that something decisive was about to take place. "You are the key to ending this conflict," Nikolai declared, his voice low and authoritative, echoing off the stone walls. "Whether you realize it or not, you are tied to me by fate." Ilara forced herself to meet his gaze, her eyes shimmering with silent defiance. "You call it fate, but I see it as captivity," she countered, though her voice wavered ever so slightly. A harsh smile ghosted across his lips. "Capitulate, and your life might be easier in the days to come. Resist, and you will only hurt yourself." Any sense of submission fled Ilara's thoughts. While fear still gnawed at her, her loyalty to Silvercrest and to herself fanned the embers of her courage. "I will never yield to you, no matter what you claim my destiny is," she spat. Her words echoed into the hush that followed, and she sensed the flicker of shock that rippled through the Shadowfang wolves at her audacity. Nikolai's face darkened, and for a moment she thought he would strike her down. Instead, he emitted a low, ominous growl that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. His eyes glimmered with predatory intent. "You are more fiery than I anticipated. Good. The blood moon is approaching fast, and it will reveal the truth of our bond. When that moment arrives, you will not be able to deny me. Then you will see how futile your resistance is." Ilara bit down on her trembling lip. She felt as if she was caught in a nightmare, one in which she was destined to stand against a menacing force that wielded both her body and her fate. But she refused to be broken, silently swearing that she would find a way to outwit him, to escape and return to those who cared about her. No matter how steep the odds, she could not let him claim victory, nor could she allow her own heart to betray her pack. That same day, Kieran stood with Jared and a group of pack trackers around a dimly lit table in Silvercrest's meeting hall. The table was strewn with maps, scratch marks, and scribbled notes. The tension in the room was so thick, but it felt suffocating. Voices were hushed, every pair of eyes reflecting anxiety and determination. A single name resonated more than any other: Nikolai. One of the trackers, a grizzled wolf named Everett, pointed to a mountain range at the far edge of the map. If they've taken her, it's likely they brought her east, toward these foothills. Shadowfang territory extends underground in a labyrinth of caverns. That rumor's been around for years, though few have actually seen it and lived to tell the tale. Kieran's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the map. Then that's where we head. We can't wait, we have to move now. The blood moon is only a few nights away, and if Nikolai dares to invoke a fated mate bond with Ilara, we might lose her forever. A hush settled over the gathered wolves. Although they trusted their alpha, the enormity of the endeavor weighed on them. Entering Shadowfang's territory on a rescue mission could incite a war, and conflict between the packs had always been a looming threat. Now, with Ilara's captivity, that threat felt imminent. "What do you need from us, Alpha?" Jared asked, stepping forward, his eyes resolute. "I need the best warriors prepared for an extraction mission. We'll do everything possible to avoid all-out war, but if it comes down to a fight, we won't back down. She's one of us, and we never abandon our own." A unified chorus of agreement arose as the wolves present pledged their loyalty. Determined to bring Ilara home, they felt the weight of the clock ticking. With the blood moon so near, the stakes were painfully high. If Nikolai succeeded in strengthening a fated bond under its crimson light, Ilara could be inextricably tied to him. Most of the group dispersed to make the necessary preparations, leaving Kieran alone with Jared. The beta stood quietly for a moment, taking in the worry etched into his alpha's features. "We'll find her, Kieran. We won't let them keep her." Kieran nodded, letting out a slow breath. "I keep thinking about the way Nikolai looked at her during the fight, as if she was already his. It's not right. Ilara belongs with us. She belongs to the Silvercrest Pack. That is the only truth I will accept." Neither of them said it out loud, but a mutual fear lingered. Fate was not something easily defied. Kieran wanted to believe that Ilara's will, her loyalty, and the unity of the pack would be enough to bring her home. But the near-mythical power of the blood moon was no small thing. It had forged alliances that endured for generations, and it had also ignited wars that ravaged entire territories. The possibility of a fated bond between Ilara and Nikolai was more than just a threat to her freedom. It was a danger to the heart of Silvercrest itself. As the day wore on, Kieran and his warriors made ready for what promised to be a perilous journey into enemy territory. They sharpened their weapons, prepared supplies, and mapped out potential paths through the forest. Every decision was calculated. The entire time, Kieran fought against the gnawing ache inside him, the unspoken concern that it might already be too late. He refused to entertain that thought for long. A part of him, primal and fierce, refused to believe that fate could be so twisted. He would bring Ilara home, no matter the cost. She was not only a valued member of his pack, she was the very embodiment of everything the Silvercrest Pack stood for: loyalty, courage, and resilience. In losing her, he feared he might lose a piece of himself. Night fell swiftly, and the moon rose in cold splendor once again, its glow hinting at the crimson veil that would soon overtake it. With each passing hour, the weight of time pressed down on Kieran's chest. Standing at the edge of Silvercrest territory, he led his warriors into the darkness, guided by the faintest whispers of Ilara's trail. He could only hope that she was holding on, that she had not been broken by Nikolai's cruelty or seduced by the power of fate that hovered around them both. Ilara paced around the cramped confines of her new prison, a small stone chamber connected to Nikolai's domain. She had been moved from the cell to this dimly lit room, which featured a narrow bed, a rickety chair, and a single high window that barely allowed a sliver of sunlight to filter through. At first glance, it looked more like a bedroom than a cage, but the thick iron lock on the door, along with the ever-present guard stationed in the corridor, ensured that her freedom remained a distant dream. Although Nikolai no longer kept her in the dank darkness of the dungeon, Ilara suspected he did so not out of kindness, but for a more insidious purpose. Perhaps he wanted to coax her into a sense of complacency, to make her more receptive to the bond he insisted was real. Determined to resist, Ilara clung to her fury and fear, using them as twin flames of defiance against the menacing aura that sought to entangle her heart. She had spent the last day devising ways to escape. The single window was too high and far too narrow for even her lean frame, and there were no loose rocks or cracks large enough to pry open. She contemplated overpowering the guard in the hallway, but the memory of her weakened state from the fight, plus the injuries she had not fully healed, gave her pause. A direct confrontation would be risky, likely ending in failure and further confinement. When she heard the lock click open, Ilara immediately sprang to the back of the room, adopting a guarded stance. Nikolai stepped through the door, followed by a thin, elderly wolf with silver hair who carried a small tray of food. The tray held bread, roasted meat, and a metal cup of water. It occurred to Ilara that she was hungry, her stomach twisted with discomfort, but she was too proud to display any vulnerability. The older wolf placed the tray on a table and gave Nikolai a respectful dip of his head before retreating. Ilara felt Nikolai's eyes upon her, measuring her every reaction. His presence radiated power, a magnetic force that tugged at the wolf inside her, provoking sensations that conflicted with the rational part of her mind. "You need to eat," Nikolai said softly, as though he were simply giving her kind advice. "I don't want anything from you," Ilara snapped, though her body betrayed her with a hollow growl in her stomach. Nikolai's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he spoke again. "Your defiance is impressive, but the blood moon comes soon. Even your spirit won't stand against fate if it chooses us to be one." She grimaced at his statement, despising the unwavering certainty in his voice. She wished she could wholeheartedly deny the possibility, to scoff at the notion that a cosmic force might link her to the man responsible for so much violence and strife. But she recalled the jolt she had felt when he first seized her, and how her wolf instincts had reacted with a mixture of alarm and an inexplicable sense of recognition. That confusion was what she fought hardest against. She longed to believe that her own willpower, along with her bond to Silvercrest, would be enough to crush the threads of any ill-fated connection. She glared at him, refusing to speak. The silence stretched between them, thick with unresolved tension. Finally, Nikolai turned to go, pausing only once to say, "Eat, rest, and prepare yourself. Your fate will be sealed soon." The door slammed shut behind him, the lock grating into place. Ilara exhaled shakily, her teeth clenched. She was not oblivious to the precarious nature of her position. If the blood moon truly did intensify the bond between fated mates, she had precious little time to find a way out. She looked at the tray, her stomach churning. Reluctantly, she picked up a piece of bread. She would need her strength, and going on a hunger strike would only make her weaker. As she ate, she thought about Kieran and the rest of the pack. She held on to the hope that he would come for her, that the Silvercrest pack would never abandon one of their own. Closing her eyes, she pictured their forest clearing and recalled the stories Kieran would often share about how the pack had survived adversities in the past. She tried to focus on the memory of him standing tall in front of his warriors, a symbol of steadfast devotion. That recollection, faint as it was, helped her cling to her resolve. Meanwhile, Kieran led his small band of skilled trackers deep into the wilderness. The going was slow, as they had to pick their way through rugged terrain and remain ever vigilant for Shadowfang scouts. Each night, when the moon rose overhead, Kieran felt the oppressive weight of the countdown. He knew that if they did not rescue Ilara soon, Nikolai might consummate a bond under the blood moon, binding Ilara to the very man who had abducted her. He set a relentless pace, driving them forward. Though his pack mates were hardened warriors, even they began to feel the strain, surviving on minimal sleep, pushing their bodies to the point of exhaustion. Jared, ever faithful at Kieran's side, gritted his teeth through an injured shoulder. Their shared determination overshadowed discomfort or pain, for the thought of Ilara suffering under Nikolai's watch spurred them onward. As the group navigated the base of a rocky cliff, they picked up the faintest trace of Ilara's scent. It was Jared who caught it first, his nostrils flaring, and his eyes brightening with excitement. Kieran's heart hammered at the confirmation that she was near, that she was alive. Something in him stirred fiercely, a protective surge that reminded him of why alphas existed, to defend their pack, their people, and the ones who mattered most. They followed the faint trail to a section of forest littered with boulders. Behind one of these, they discovered a concealed entrance leading into a maze of twisting tunnels. The earthen smell, mingled with the faint tang of damp rock, quickly overwhelmed any stronger scents that might have lingered. Kieran exchanged a glance with Jared, their silent understanding indicating they had found the edge of the Shadowfang domain. Leaving two of their warriors, Bryce and Ingrid, on guard outside, Kieran and Jared advanced into the labyrinth with 3 others, all of whom were experienced scouts. Torches in hand, they pressed deeper, hearts pounding at every scrape of rock underfoot. The passage wound on, opening into natural caverns with stalactites hanging like fangs from the ceiling. The gloom was pervasive, swallowing them whole, but they pressed forward. The deeper they descended, the more Kieran felt his wolf stirring anxiously, urging him to be on high alert. He could sense the presence of other wolves. The echo of footsteps and low growls in the distance signaled patrols. Their greatest advantage was that Shadowfang likely would not expect a direct incursion. If Kieran and his wolves could just slip by the patrols and locate Ilara, they might extract her without launching a full-scale conflict. Still, the possibility of confrontation loomed large. Kieran tensed at every small sound, scanning for the slightest movement along the jagged walls. His only comfort was the knowledge that the blood moon had not yet risen, meaning there might still be time to prevent the forging of a tragic bond. Back in her cramped chamber, Ilara paced in restless circles, wrestling with a wariness that threatened to crush her hope. She had tried to feign curiosity earlier in front of one of the guards, inquiring about the labyrinth of tunnels. The god, a sneering man named Tobias, gave little away, but she learned enough to realize that these underground tunnels went on for miles. Escaping without guidance or a map would be nearly impossible. As the hours dragged on, she found her eyes drifting toward the heavy wooden door. She had begun to count the intervals between the guard rotations, noting each time the corridor grew momentarily quiet. Her restless determination inspired a bold plan. If she could time it right, she might manage to slip into the corridor and outrun the guard. Once free of the immediate watch, she could attempt to navigate the tunnels by following the air currents or the faint traces of moonlight seeping through overhead vents. But the risk was monumental. A single misstep, and she would face punishment, or worse, an even tighter lock and chain. Nonetheless, the alternative, waiting for the blood moon and letting fate decide her future, terrified her more than any punishment Nikolai could inflict. A key turned in the lock again, causing her heart to leap into her throat. She braced for the possibility that Nikolai was returning, but this time it was a tall, sallow-faced wolf who stepped inside. He held something folded in his arms. Dropping it on the bed, he made a curt gesture for her to pick it up. "It is the Alpha's wish you wear this for the ceremony," the wolf said, his tone devoid of emotion. Elora's eyes flicked down at the garment. It was a simple white dress, flowing and delicate, the sort one might wear for a sacred event. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized the significance. Nikolai was preparing to hold a ritual beneath the upcoming blood moon. Her eyes snapped back to the guard, defiance blazing. "I won't be part of his twisted ceremony." The guard shrugged. "That is between you and the Alpha. I am only delivering the attire." He left as abruptly as he had come, the door shutting firmly behind him. Ilara stared at the garment, anger and panic swirling within her. The mere thought of being bound to Nikolai against her will, of being forced to stand beneath the crimson moon to declare something as sacred as a mate bond, was more than her heart could bear. She clenched her fists, her breath turning ragged as she allowed her fury to ignite her determination. She would not go quietly into that ceremony. If the blood moon was near, then her time to act was now. She had to escape, or at least disrupt Nikolai's plan, so that the bond could never be solidified. Even if she failed, she would try with every ounce of her strength. As night settled into the labyrinth of tunnels, the sound of distant footsteps in the corridor eventually faded into near silence. Ilara pressed herself to the wooden door, listening intently. Minutes ticked by. She heard a muffled exchange of voices, and then footsteps receding. Her heart thudded in her chest. This could be her window of opportunity. She moved quickly, improvising with what little she had. She grabbed the metal cup from her meal tray, drained the remaining water, and quietly positioned herself at the hinge side of the door. If she timed it right, she might be able to startle the guard and slip out before he could react. Her plan was precarious at best. She had no weapon. She was weakened from her captivity, and the labyrinth was hostile territory. Still, she took a slow, steadying breath, focusing on the primal instincts that came naturally to her wolf. Silence enveloped the corridor. In that stillness, Ilara eased the door open a fraction and peered out. The guard in the hallway was leaning back against the wall, his eyes drooping with fatigue. Whether he was dozing or simply letting his guard down, it might be the only chance she got. She set her jaw, every muscle tensing with adrenaline. Then, summoning courage from deep within, she flung the door wide and lunged at the guard. He jerked awake, startled, but not in time to fully defend himself. Ilara slammed the metal cup into his temple, drawing a groan from him as he staggered sideways. She kicked out at his legs, knocking him off balance. By sheer luck, or maybe, by the force of desperation, he went down. She darted past him, scarcely daring to look back. Her bare feet pounded the cold stone floor as she sprinted down the dim corridor. She heard the guard's recovering growl behind her, echoing in the cavern. She knew he would raise an alarm. Time was measured in heartbeats now. Torches and sconces lit her way, but the corridors branched off repeatedly, each passage threatening to lead her deeper into the labyrinth. She turned sharply whenever she saw the faintest hint of an upward slope, reasoning that, if she wanted to reach the surface, she needed to always ascend. The space was a twisting maze of stone, and the echoes of her footfalls melded with the frantic racing of her thoughts. She passed doors carved into the rock, uncertain if they were storage areas or living quarters. Her heart thundered as she glimpsed movement in a side tunnel. She saw the silhouette of another guard rushing in her direction. Without stopping to think, she turned down a different corridor, stifling a whimper when she realized it led to a dead end. Panic surged in her veins. She whirled, preparing to double back, only to be confronted by the guard's towering figure. He grinned, revealing elongated canines, his eyes brimming with malicious amusement. "Thought you could escape, did you?" he taunted, stepping forward. Ilara's pulse roared in her ears. She crouched defensively, every fiber of her being demanding she at least try to fight. The guard lunged, swinging a heavy arm aimed at her ribs. She dodged, ignoring the sharp pang in her side, and tried to counter with a clawed slash. She managed to scratch him, but her victory was short-lived. He batted her hand away as though she were a toy, seized her hair, and yanked her head back, forcing her into a vulnerable position. She hissed in pain, arms flailing, but his grip was iron. Another guard appeared at the entrance to the corridor, panting from the chase. Together, they subdued Ilara, twisting her arms behind her back until she cried out. She tried to fight, but her battered muscles had reached their limit. Her vision blurred with tears of rage and frustration as she realized she was being dragged back into the Shadowfang stronghold. They forced her into the same chamber she had tried to flee, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the walls. One guard pinned her to the ground, while the other secured her wrists with thick leather restraints. She struggled in vain, a part of her refusing to concede. After what felt like an eternity, they left her there, gasping for air, hands bound in front of her. She trembled, tears of anger burning her eyes. She knew the consequences of her failed escape could be dire. This time, Nikolai might choose to keep her in the dungeon, starve her, or worse, accelerate the ceremony so she could not try another desperate plan. Her fear proved justified when Nikolai arrived soon after, looking more enraged than she had ever seen him. The tension in the room amplified, making the air feel almost unbreathable. For a long moment he just stared down at her, his chest heaving with silent fury. "You would risk your life so foolishly?" he demanded, voice tight. Ilara responded with a glare that held no small amount of hatred. "I would never settle for captivity. Better to die than be a pawn in your twisted game." His nostrils flared, and for an instant she glimpsed a flicker of something like uncertainty in his eyes, perhaps a moment of doubt or a swirl of conflicting emotions. But it vanished, replaced by a steely mask of resolve. "You should rest, little wolf," he said with a quiet menace that made her stomach twist. "You will soon see that fate does not bend to your defiance." He snapped his fingers, signaling two subordinates who strode in to stand guard. The message was clear. She would not be left alone, not even for a moment. Exhausted and on the verge of collapse, Ilara could do nothing but swallow her fury. Despite her bound hands, her bruised arms, and her fractured sense of hope, she held on to one unwavering truth: she would not surrender to him. She had lost this battle, but the war was not over. In another part of the tunnels, Kieran and his small group advanced with painstaking caution. They occasionally heard muffled voices or the distant clamor of footsteps, forcing them to halt, press against the walls, and extinguish their torches. Each time, Kieran's heart pounded in his ears, fear warring with the hope that Ilara was somewhere close. When they paused in an open cavern to catch their breath, Jared motioned them into the shadows behind a cluster of stalagmites. The distant flicker of torchlight on the walls suggested a patrol was nearby. They waited, breaths held, until the footsteps receded into silence. Only then did Jared relax slightly, though he kept his voice hushed. "Alpha, we need to figure out where they might be holding her. Wandering aimlessly through these tunnels will get us all caught." Kieran nodded. "We need a plan. We'll try to observe their patterns, see if there's a main cluster of guards that might indicate a cell or a restricted area. That's likely where they'd keep her." Their stealthy movements eventually led them to a corridor with more frequent torch placements. The faint odor of cooking food and the bustle of activity hinted at living quarters nearby. The group pressed themselves into an alcove, watching carefully as a handful of Shadowfang wolves passed. They were carrying wooden crates, likely supplies for the stronghold. With practiced stealth, Kieran and the others followed at a safe distance, hoping the supplies would lead them to the heart of the domain. Turning a corner, they came upon a large corridor lined with doors. Sentinels were posted at intervals, their postures indicating readiness. Kieran inhaled deeply, scanning each detail, searching for a sign. Suddenly, a distant noise echoed through the passage, the sound of the door being slammed, followed by raised voices. Kieran exchanged a swift look with Jared. That might be the key. The group slipped away from the main corridor, circling around to where they suspected the voices had come from. They found themselves in a narrow passage, dimly lit, the walls damp with subterranean moisture. At the far end stood a single door, guarded by two formidable-looking wolves. Kieran felt his pulse spike. Something about the tension of the guards, the way they stayed unwaveringly at their post, convinced him that Ilara could be close. He inched nearer, pressing his back to the cold stone wall, trying to overhear anything from within. The guards seemed particularly on edge, their expressions grim, as though they had just witnessed a confrontation. His mind raced. If Ilara was truly behind that door, how could he reach her without alerting the entire stronghold? Fighting the two guards would draw attention, but he had come too far to turn back without her. He signaled Jared and the others to draw in closer, huddling for a strategy. "Was might draw them away," Jared whispered. "The rest can slip inside, assuming that door is unlocked or easily broken. But if it's not, the guards will return before we can free her." Kieran's jaw tightened. He wasn't about to abandon caution, yet time was of the essence. The blood moon was closing in, and every wasted minute heightened the likelihood that Nikolai would force Ilara into a bond. It was then that they heard another sound from inside the room, a muffled protest, feminine in tone. Kieran's heart clenched painfully. It had to be her. There was no more time for careful deliberation. With a silent nod to each other, they sprang into action. Jared and another warrior crept forward, stepping on the tips of their toes, careful not to produce any echoing footfall. At the last moment, the guard on the right spotted them, eyes widening. But it was too late. Jared lunged, driving a hard blow into the guard's midsection, while the other Silvercrest warrior tackled the second guard, clamping a hand over his mouth before he could raise the alarm. Kieran dashed toward the door, ignoring the scuffle behind him. He discovered, to his relief, that it was locked by a simple bar on the outside. He slid it free, wincing at the soft scrape of metal, then pushed the door open to reveal the small chamber lit by a single torch on the wall. Inside, the sight broke his heart. Ilara lay on the floor, wrists bound by leather straps, eyes wide with defiance and dismay. Her hair was mussed, and dark bruises marred her arms. But she was alive. Relief poured through Kieran as he raced to her side and knelt, gently cradling her face in his hands. She blinked up at him, a flash of disbelief crossing her features. "Kieran," she whispered, as though afraid he might be a mirage. "Shh, I'm here," he assured her, fingers trembling as he carefully undid the restraints. The leather slipped away, and Ilara flexed her sore wrists. "You came," she breathed, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. "Of course I came," he murmured, a fervent heat shining in his gaze. "Did you really think I wouldn't move heaven and earth to bring you home?" Their moment of relief was shattered by the clamor in the corridor. One of the guards who had been tackled managed to release a muffled cry before being subdued again. The noise echoed ominously through the labyrinth. It would not be long before reinforcements arrived. Jared appeared at the threshold, panting. "We have to move, now." Ilara attempted to stand, her legs wobbling from exhaustion. Kieran supported her, his arm around her waist, eyes brimming with concern. But they had no time to waste on gentleness. With quick steps, they left the room. Jared led the way, while the other Silvercrest wolves flanked them, ready for the fight they were certain to encounter. No sooner had they rounded the first corner than alarm bells began to resound through the cavern, an ominous chorus signaling the presence of intruders. Shadowfang warriors emerged from side passages, brandishing weapons or snarling in wolf form. Under normal circumstances, Kieran would have engaged them head-on, but Ilara was their priority. With a low growl, he motioned for the group to veer into a narrower corridor where the enemy could not easily surround them. Clashing bodies and scraping metal filled the confined space. Ilara, though weak, refused to cower. She scratched and kicked at any Shadowfang wolf who got too close, determined not to be dead weight. Kieran, fueled by protective rage, bared his teeth and struck at their attackers, each movement reflecting the lethal grace of a born alpha. Jared matched him with unyielding resolve, grappling with a brute of a wolf who towered above him. Despite the threat that pressed in from every angle, they carved a path through the tunnel. At last they spilled out into a larger cavern, where a faint glimmer of moonlight trickled in from above. A jagged opening in the rocky ceiling revealed the night sky, a slice of star-studded blackness. But the moment they emerged, more Shadowfang warriors converged. Nikolai himself stepped out from the opposite end of the cavern, his expression thunderous. Ilara felt an unbidden shiver slip down her spine at the sight of him. The bond she had been trying so hard to deny flared in his presence, sending her senses into turmoil. But now Kieran was beside her, and she felt a firm anchor in his presence, reminding her that she was not alone. Nikolai's piercing gaze zeroed in on Kieran, then on Ilara, a dangerous fury flaring across his features. "Hand her over," he barked, voice echoing off the cavern walls. "She is mine by fate's design." Kieran tightened his hold on Ilara, instinctively stepping protectively in front of her. "She belongs to no one but herself." he roared back, eyes flashing with challenge. And certainly not to you, Nikolai. The two alphas, both bristling with adrenaline, faced each other across the open space. Nikolai's warriors spread out, attempting to encircle the Silvercrest group. Tension crackled in the air like a storm about to break. At that moment, Ilara realized the rescue had turned into a confrontation that could decide the fate of both packs. Nikolai, your cruelty has proven you unworthy of anything sacred, Kieran hissed, baring his canines. Fate or not, you're delusional if you think we'll let you keep one of our own. Nikolai's lips curled back in a sneer. You think you can simply steal my mate? The blood moon is almost here. Its power will seal what is written in the stars, and not even you can stand against that. Step aside, or I will have no choice but to destroy you. All around them, the Shadowfang warriors growled in agreement, eager for a command to tear into flesh. The Silvercrest wolves, though fewer in number, refused to flinch, their loyalty and resolve shining in their eyes. The moment teetered on a blade's edge. Ilara could hardly breathe, torn between relief at seeing Kieran and dread at what would happen next. She could feel a subtle pull in her gut, a sensation that defied logic, as though the moon itself whispered that Nikolai's words about fate might hold a grain of truth. Yet every fiber of her being revolted at the notion of being bound to a man who had caused so much suffering. She clung to Kieran, drawing on his unwavering spirit. The stillness shattered in a heartbeat. Nikolai lunged, claws extended, aiming a blow straight at Kieran. Kieran met him halfway, and the force of their collision reverberated through the cavern. Chaos broke out as warriors from both packs clashed, and the air filled with yells, snarls, and the distinct ring of metal on stone. At the heart of it all, the two alphas grappled like forces of nature. Each blow echoed with supernatural power. Ilara watched in horror and awe as they traded strikes, Nikolai's savage ferocity pitted against Kieran's steadfast resolve. She knew how much was riding on this encounter. If Kieran fell, so would her final hopes of escaping the fate Nikolai intended for her. For a moment it seemed Nikolai had the upper hand, as he delivered a punishing strike to Kieran's shoulder, causing the Silvercrest Alpha to stumble. Ilara's heart seized in her chest. But Kieran rallied, fueled by something far deeper than pride. With a guttural roar, he spun and slashed at Nikolai's flank. Blood sprayed across the stone floor. The Shadowfang Alpha howled in agony, and the wolves of both packs paused, as though transfixed by the sight of their leader wounded. Nikolai's eyes burned with rage. His chest heaved. Every muscle in his body tensed, revealing a man living on the edge of his own fury. Ilara knew that a wounded alpha could be the most dangerous foe of all, driven to fight with reckless abandon. She watched, breath quickening, as he prepared to unleash a final, savage attack on Kieran. Just then, the faint glow from the cavern opening above shifted, and a shaft of moonlight, tinted with the barest hint of red, fell over them. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature swept through Ilara. She turned her gaze upward. Clouds parted, revealing a moon that was no longer purely silver, but tinged with crimson, heralding the approach of the dreaded blood moon. For a heartbeat, every wolf in the cavern felt it, an ancient resonance, a call to destiny that pulsed through their blood. Ilara gasped, an uncanny heat surging through her veins. Beside her, Kieran let out a ragged breath, sensing the cosmic shift. Across from them, Nikolai locked his gaze onto Ilara, eyes alight with primal hunger, as if the moon's power was intensifying his hold over her. Ilara's thoughts raced in the kaleidoscope of moonlight and clashing wills. She had little doubt that Nikolai would risk everything to claim her under that crimson glow. And Kieran, dear, loyal, steadfast Kieran, would fight to the end to save her. But was it enough to defy the pull of fate, if indeed fate had decreed that she belonged to the very Alpha who had stolen her away? Her heart hammered wildly, caught between fear and a faint, desperate hope that perhaps it was not destiny that mattered, but choice, the choice of her heart. If she held to that, maybe, just maybe, she could escape the inevitable bond that threatened to claim her soul. They had reached a moment of truth. The blood moon rose higher in the sky, deepening its haunting hue, and soon there would be no turning back. Nikolai locked eyes with Kieran, both alphas braced beneath the newly revealed glow of the crimson-tinted moon. The tension in the cavern thickened, every being within those walls, Shadowfang and Silvercrest alike, acutely aware that the blood moon's ascendance heralded a moment of destiny. In that charged instant, nothing else seemed to exist. The labyrinth's damp air, the flicker of torchlight on the rough stone, the roar of battle that had been raging only moments before, all of it faded as the two adversaries squared off. Their postures reflected primal authority, and Ilara could feel the waves of power that radiated from them. A hush descended over the immediate vicinity, as though even the most hardened warriors sensed they were standing at a crossroads that would determine the fate of more than just a single captive. This was a test of will and spirit, pitting two alphas against each other, under the most potent moon in all werewolf lore. Ilara stood in the periphery, her arms sore and her heartbeat galloping. She felt Jared's presence at her side, and two other Silvercrest wolves protected her on the flanks, while Kieran, injured and breathing heavily, was poised for another clash with Nikolai. "You cannot deny the blood moon," Nikolai spat, leveling a finger at Ilara. His words echoed through the cavern. "Its power will seal what is already written. One way or another, she will be mine." Ilara shuddered. Something within her reacted to the moonlight, as though her blood was being stirred by an invisible thread connecting her to Nikolai's claim. She bit down on her lip, struggling to contain the surge of conflicting emotions. She had grown up hearing legends of how the blood moon could reveal hidden truths about mates, forging ties that could transcend even the strongest loyalties. Yet, every part of her human heart and wolf spirit rejected the idea that she was fated to someone so cruel. She forced her gaze onto Kieran's broad back, feeling an anchor in his nearness. Kieran's growl reverberated through the air. Though he bled from a gash on his shoulder, his eyes were ablaze with pure, undiluted resolve. "We forge our destinies through choices, not some twisted prophecy. She belongs to her own heart, and to no one else." He lunged, his entire body coiling with lethal grace. The impact of his collision with Nikolai rattled the cavern floor, sending dust drifting from the ceiling. Ilara watched, pulse in her throat, as the two alphas struggled in a brutal contest of strength. Their snarls and roars blended with the renewed clash of the surrounding warriors. One Shadowfang wolf attacked Jared, but Jared ducked and countered, channeling the furious loyalty he felt for his pack. Shadowfang and Silvercrest warriors clashed in every corner of the open space, teeth bared, claws slashing, weapons clanging against stone. The cacophony of voices and the primal scent of blood and sweat filled the air, overshadowing all earlier quiet. Torches flared, casting dancing shadows on the walls that made every combatant appear larger than life. Ilara could scarcely draw breath amidst the chaos, her mind racing with possible escape routes or ways she might help without endangering the others. Kieran gained a fleeting advantage, slamming Nikolai against a stalagmite and causing a grimace of pain to cross the Shadowfang Alpha's face. For an instant, it seemed that Kieran might deliver a decisive blow. Then Nikolai twisted, using his immense upper body strength to wrench free, slashing at Kieran's midsection. Kieran staggered back, a snarl curling his lips as he clutched his side. Terror flashed through Ilara. She saw Nikolai raise an arm to strike again, but she also witnessed Kieran's unwavering drive, the way he refused to cave under the Shadowfang Alpha's might. In that instant, despite her own exhaustion, she felt a surge of defiance so potent that it seemed to light a fire in her veins. She refused to let Kieran pay the ultimate price for her freedom. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, Ilara bolted forward, ignoring the protests of her battered body. She leaped between them, aiming a blow at Nikolai's outstretched arm. She fully expected him to cast her aside with ease, but to her surprise, her interruption disrupted his aim. His strike missed its intended target by mere inches. A vicious grin twisted Nikolai's features. "Foolish, but brave," he muttered, his eyes gleaming as he seized Ilara's forearm in a bruising grip. "This proves my point. You cannot fight what the Blood Moon has decreed. Your wolf answers to me, no matter how hard you struggle." She tried to wrench free, but he was too strong. Kieran roared her name, surging forward to rip her from Nikolai's grasp. However, Nikolai reacted faster, using Ilara as leverage. He twisted, slamming his elbow into the center of Kieran's chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Within a blink, Nikolai had Ilara pinned, his hold on her a potent mix of dominance and that unsettling, electric pull she despised yet could not wholly ignore. Desperation welled up within Ilara. She could taste the metallic tang of blood on her tongue. Her wolf instincts soared to the surface, demanding she shift, to bare her fangs and rake claws across this dangerous male who dared claim her as a trophy. But something else warred in her chest. A trembling truth she fought to suppress. A reluctant recognition that Nikolai's voice was stirring an odd resonance in her soul. A resonance she wished would vanish. Kieran dragged himself upright, his breathing labored, his eyes blazing with wrath. His attention flicked to Ilara, pinned beneath Nikolai, and the protective fury that crossed his face made him look ready to demolish everything in his path. Through clenched teeth, he uttered, "Get away from her." Nikolai only tightened his grip, drawing Ilara closer as though to display his power to the entire cavern. "Her fate is tied to mine, whether you like it or not, and with the blood moon at its height, there is no turning back. I will consummate the bond tonight, and neither you nor any other wolf in these lands can stop me." Yet, as he said the words, his dark eyes briefly flickered with something akin to hesitation, as though a part of him also wrestled with the sheer force of fate. Ilara caught that subtle shift, but had no time to ponder it. For an instant later, Kieran hurled himself forward in one final, desperate attempt. He collided with Nikolai, the force of impact throwing them into a tangled spin. Ilara tumbled free, gasping in relief as she scrambled away to avoid being trapped again. The two alphas crashed into a rock formation, each landing savage blows that echoed through the chamber. Their packmates circled, suspended in a half-beat of uncertainty, torn between helping their leader and preserving their own lives amidst the raging battle. Jared rushed to Ilara's side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. She saw blood trickling from his lip, but his eyes were fierce. "We have to get you out," he said, voice tense. "Kieran can hold him off, but not forever. And if the blood moon completes its cycle, Nikolai might. He didn't finish. He didn't need to." Ilara understood the implications. Already the moon's deepening crimson light felt like a living energy in her veins, whispering the old myths of fated bonds. She glanced back at Kieran, who grappled with Nikolai in a dance of brutality, each punch and slash filled with an urgency that defied normal stamina. The slickness of blood covered both of them. In the flickering torchlight, Nikolai threw back his head and let out a roar of frustration. The force of his cries shook the air, calling to his nearby packmates. One by one, they turned toward him. Some had been in the midst of fighting Silvercrest wolves, while others lay wounded. Yet, at the sound of their alpha's command, a collective hush overtook them, and a wave of tension rippled through the cavern. "Shadowfang," Nikolai growled, his voice rumbling with dark authority. "Protect this union at all costs." His words ignited a renewed frenzy. The wolves under his command surged forward with the wild fervor of zealots, determined to secure what their alpha declared was destined by the blood moon. Silvercrest wolves fought back valiantly, but they were outnumbered, forced to yield ground inch by inch. Ilara's heart sank as she realized the fragile hold that Kieran and his warriors had gained was slipping away. Despair roiled in her stomach. She could no longer remain passive, clinging to the hope that Kieran alone would rescue her. If they were all to survive this night, she had to do more than hide behind her pack's shields. Summoning every ounce of bravery she possessed, she tugged on Jared's sleeve. "Help me," she said, her voice shaking with a blend of determination and residual terror. "We can't just run. We have to break Nikolai's hold over his pack, or we'll never escape. If the rest of Shadowfang sees me choosing Kieran, maybe they'll realize that no matter what the blood moon suggests, the bond won't hold if I reject it." Jared's expression revealed uncertainty. His protective instincts told him to get Ilara as far from Nikolai as possible. Yet the conviction in her eyes, combined with the pressing danger, made him pause. His gaze darted around the cavern. Kieran was locked in savage combat, while the rest of the Silvercrest wolves struggled to keep the Shadowfang warriors from swarming them. It was true that simply running for the exit would only delay the inevitable, especially if the blood moon ceremony could be completed anywhere Nikolai chose. "All right," Jared said finally, gripping her arm to emphasize his point. "But be careful. If you step between them again—" "He might, I know," Ilara interrupted, inhaling shakily. "But I can't let Kieran die for me." They shared a swift, resolute look. Then, while the chaos of battle roiled around them, Jared led Ilara on a winding path through the labyrinth of fighting wolves, seeking a vantage point from which her voice or presence could carry. It felt like a reckless plan, perhaps even foolish. Still, the bond that threatened to claim her heart and seal her to Nikolai could only be battled with the raw will of the one who supposedly stood at its center, Ilara herself. She threaded her way past a snarling pair of wolves whose fur bristled as they snapped at each other, her hands trembling as she pressed her back against the uneven cave wall to avoid being drawn into the scuffle. Fragments of conversation and yelps of pain filled her ears. She caught glimpses of Shadowfang faces, some glowering with dogged loyalty to Nikolai, others shadowed with confusion, perhaps uncertain whether to continue fighting for a cause that involved forced captivity of a mate. At last, Jared guided her onto a low, rocky outcropping overlooking the battle. There, with the blood moon's light cascading through the jagged opening overhead, Ilara planted her feet and took in the swirling pandemonium below. She spotted Kieran's dark figure and Nikolai's savage aura locked in violent collision near the center of the cavern. Dust churned under their feet, torches flared and guttered, and the sound of blood pounding in her ears made time slow to a crawl. Ilara swallowed hard, then lifted her chin, willing her voice to carry. "Shadowfang," she cried, the word emerging in a shaky tone that caught the attention of a few wolves nearby. "Your Alpha claims I belong to him, but I am here of my own free will, right now, and I am telling you that I reject him." Her voice echoed in the rocky space, a clarion call in the midst of the din. The effect was immediate, but not universal. Some Shadowfang wolves paused, ears perked, evidently hearing a claim that contradicted their Alpha's decree. Others bared their teeth in anger, snarling that she was defying a sacred tradition. But the important thing was that they heard her, and that hesitation was enough to break part of their momentum. Kieran, struggling in a clinch with Nikolai, caught Alara's words and felt a surge of renewed strength. He managed to shove Nikolai back, landing another brutal strike. Nikolai coughed, spitting crimson onto the cavern floor, and his intense gaze flicked toward Ilara. "Stop this," Ilara continued, ignoring the protests of her raw throat. Her voice rose again, reverberating over the clash of steel and growls. "Fate is not forced. If it was truly meant to be, I would have accepted him willingly. But I do not. I will not. I choose Silvercrest. I choose my pack. I choose to walk away from any false bond the blood moon might suggest." For an agonizing heartbeat, no one responded. Then Nikolai let out a thunderous snarl, cutting through the stillness like a whip. He wrenched himself from Kieran's proximity, ignoring the fresh wound that bled freely from his side. With supernatural speed, he crossed the cavern's uneven floor, a predatory fury twisting his features. Before Ilara could leap away, he seized her by the wrist and hurled her from the rocky ledge onto the cavern floor. Her breath whooshed out as she landed in a bruising sprawl. "You dare to speak against the will of the blood moon," Nikolai spat, looming over her with burning eyes. "You do not understand the power that runs in your veins. We are fated mates, and denying it will only prolong the inevitable." Alara tried to push herself up, but he pressed a hand to her shoulder, pinning her in place. Despair crept in, turning her limbs to lead. Maybe there was no escaping the ancient magic that swirled above them in the blood moon's ominous glow. The mere touch of Nikolai's hand was enough to send a cascade of confusing sensations through her body. Disgust, yes, but also an electric hum that felt larger than either of them. Kieran, seeing Nikolai's hold on her, roared her name and rushed forward, but a cluster of Shadowfang wolves blocked his path, determined to protect their Alpha's claim. Ilara's breath came in strained bursts, and she fought to maintain clarity. Jared tried to slash through the ring of adversaries, but was repeatedly driven back. Her entire body shook with fear and loathing at being held so brutally, yet she willed herself not to surrender, not to let the darkness close in. Nikolai leaned down, lowering his voice to a level only she could hear. "If your heart resists me so thoroughly," he rasped, "then why did you feel the jolt of recognition when I touched you? Do not pretend you did not sense it. I saw it in your eyes." She closed her eyes against the tears that threatened to spill. Because it was true. She had felt it, that single, devastating jolt, the deep part of her wolf nature that awakened at the press of his aura. But it was overshadowed by her moral revulsion at his cruelty, his actions, and the violence he wrought. She had no trust in him, no love. All she felt in his presence was fear, fury, and that strange undercurrent she wished she could extinguish once and for all. She pried one hand free enough to clutch at the ground, trying to find leverage. "I do not believe that is real," she hissed through gritted teeth. "I know what my heart tells me, and it rejects you." A flicker of pain crossed Nikolai's face, so swift she could barely register it. Then he snarled, as though determined to rid himself of any hint of weakness. With a swift motion, he pulled her upright, pressing her back against his chest, his arm clamped around her shoulders. In a grim, resonant voice that carried throughout the cavern, he bellowed, "We will hold the ritual tonight, under the blood moon, whether she accepts or not. And woe to any wolf who dares defy me." There was a collective gasp, even among some Shadowfang warriors. The forced mating ritual was considered taboo in many werewolf traditions, regarded as a dark corruption of what should be a sacred union. Yet a few loyalists howled their support, as though they believed unwaveringly in their alpha's right to claim a fated mate by any means. Ilara's eyes darted to Kieran. He was still trapped behind a wall of hostile wolves, his breath ragged, blood trickling down his side, but his gaze burned with an unyielding ferocity. Seeing him there, surrounded yet undefeated, gave her a glimmer of courage. She focused on that small spark, fueling her resolve not to succumb to Nikolai's threats. But she was not prepared for Nikolai's next move. He jerked her head to the side, exposing her neck to the moonlit chamber. The gesture was a clear sign that he intended to seal the mate bond in the most violent way possible by biting her under the full glow of the blood moon. A swirl of dread engulfed her as she recognized what that implied. If he managed to sink his fangs into her flesh and draw upon the moon's potent magic, it could transform their tenuous link into something unbreakable, enslaving her to him for life. She fought him, clawing at his arm, but his grip was made stronger by anger and that unholy determination. In the corner of her vision, she saw Kieran slam his shoulder into the mass of wolves blocking him, scattering them with an explosion of raw strength. The Silvercrest Alpha sprinted across the cavern, leaping over the prone bodies of defeated Shadowfang warriors. She felt an eruption of relief, as though hope itself was charging to her rescue. A single step too late. Nikolai lowered his head, canines gleaming in the scarlet-tinged luminescence. Ilara screamed, a raw, desperate sound, certain that everything she cherished, her freedom, her identity, her chance to choose her own fate, was about to be obliterated in an irrevocable instant. Then came a deafening snarl, followed by the thunderous crash of bodies. Kieran tackled Nikolai with such force that the three of them, Kieran, Nikolai, and Ilara, went crashing into the side of the cavern. Stalactites rattled overhead, bits of rock and dirt cascading upon them in a haze of dust. Nikolai lost his hold on Ilara, giving her just enough time to scramble away, her eyes stinging from the debris. Kieran and Nikolai wrestled brutally on the ground, fists, claws, and even fangs clashing. Ilara's mind reeled. The bond was not sealed. The bite had not happened. Relief warred with persistent terror as she pressed her back to a rock, panting, watching the two alphas tear into each other with lethal intent. She heard the frantic roars of other combatants in the distance, but her vision tumbled on the savage fight unfolding before her. Nikolai threw Kieran off, scrambling to his feet. His chest rose and fell in ragged bursts. Blood coated both men, making it difficult to tell whose injuries were worse. Kieran was slower to rise, but when he did, his posture radiated unwavering resolve. He spared Ilara a brief glance, silently confirming that she was alive, then turned back to face Nikolai. "I will protect her," Kieran said, in a voice that rumbled with finality, stepping forward. "Whether you are fated to her or not, she doesn't want you, and you have no right to force a bond. That breaks every law of decency among our kind." Nikolai bared his teeth in a mixture of rage and something else that might have been heartbreak. "You speak as though you know anything of the laws of fate. I have seen the signs. I have felt the blood moon's call. She is my fated mate, and I will not let her slip through my fingers to follow a weaker bond. Ah. Ilara tensed. Weaker bond? She understood the unspoken insinuation. Somewhere deep in her heart, a new realization took root. Her loyalty, perhaps her love, extended to Kieran, a feeling that had grown in quiet ways over time, through shared battles, late-night strategy talks, or the unwavering trust he placed in her ability to become stronger. If the Blood Moon's bond was forged on some cosmic level, then her bond with Kieran was formed by something far more tangible, the choices they made to fight for each other. Clinging to that fragile but potent truth, she pushed to her feet, ignoring the screaming protest of her battered body. She would not be a helpless prize to be fought over. With the barest flick of her hand, she signaled Jared, who remained on the edges of the fray, poised to intervene if needed. The beta nodded, comprehension lighting his gaze. He began corralling the remaining Silvercrest wolves, using the brief lull in direct combat to gain a more strategic position. Kieran and Nikolai circled each other like predators on the hunt, both running on adrenaline and raw determination. This was more than a territorial dispute or a clash of alphas. This was the raw edge between duty and obsession, love and fate. The air crackled with tension, and the blood moon continued its steady climb overhead, bathing the cavern in deepening red. Nikolai lunged first, raking his claws across Kieran's already bloodied torso. Kieran grunted but countered swiftly, his elbow connecting with the underside of Nikolai's jaw. The blow knocked Nikolai back, momentarily dazed. Seizing the chance, Kieran tackled him with all his weight, driving him into the stone floor. The impact reverberated through the rocks, a teeth-rattling thud that caused some onlookers to flinch. The two men grappled violently, each striving to overpower the other. Nikolai's strength was enhanced by an unshakable conviction that the blood moon was on his side, that it was his right to take Ilara. Kieran's will was fueled by something far more personal, the realization that if he failed, Ilara would be lost to a forced bond. He refused to let that happen. For a terrible moment, Nikolai gained the upper hand. He managed to pin Kieran's arms, pressing a forearm across Kieran's throat to cut off his air. Kieran's eyes bulged, his face turning ruddy, and Ilara let out a strangled cry. She rushed forward, intending to help, but Nikolai's eyes glinted dangerously, daring her to come closer. His snarling mouth twisted into a sadistic grin, as though he relished how close he was to destroying Kieran in front of her. At the 11th hour, Kieran twisted his body, using the slickness of blood to slip one arm free. He brought his elbow up hard into Nikolai's temple. Nikolai let out a guttural bellow, momentarily loosened his grip, and Kieran threw him off with everything he had left. Both men stumbled to opposite ends of the cavern floor, breathing heavily, eyes locked. This final confrontation was reaching its apex. Even the surrounding warriors, both Shadowfang and Silvercrest, slowed their fighting, compelled by the magnetic pull of what was happening at the center of the cave. Ilara could feel the crackling tension in the air, and she knew that in the next few moments, something irreversible would occur. Kieran's eyes moved to Ilara, silently communicating a depth of longing and protectiveness that made her heart clench. She felt tears threaten to spill, but she blinked them away, understanding that this was the moment he would either defend her freedom or die trying. Nikolai, panting and wounded, raised a trembling arm. "So be it," he growled, each syllable edged with bitterness and pain. "We conclude this now." Kieran launched himself forward in a final explosive attack. Nikolai roared and charged to meet him. Their bodies collided with such force that the sound reverberated through the room like rolling thunder. They grappled, hands locked, each trying to overpower the other. Nikolai bared his fangs, snapping at Kieran's neck, but Kieran used the momentum to pivot, throwing Nikolai off balance. In the flurry of limbs, they slammed into a jutting stone formation, and Nikolai cried out as his back struck the jagged edge. Kieran, seizing the advantage, delivered a punishing blow that sent Nikolai toppling to his knees. Blood dripped steadily from Nikolai's side, and he glared up at Kieran with a mixture of fury, disbelief, and a flicker of despair. The entire cavern seemed to hold its breath. Kieran stood over Nikolai, chest heaving, his fists clenched. Ilara trembled, uncertain whether he would deliver a killing blow. She felt torn, repulsed by Nikolai's crimes, but also wary of the cycle of violence that seemed to trap them all. Nikolai's lips curled into a snarl, yet behind the rage lay a deep-seated anguish. "You think you have won," he spat, "but the Blood Moon's truth cannot be denied. Ilara will never be entirely yours. Part of her will always feel the tether to me." Before Kieran could reply, Ilara found the strength to approach. She knelt beside Kieran, her voice soft but resolute. "A bond is more than just a cosmic thread. A bond is built on trust, respect, and love. Whatever I felt before, whatever strange spark happened, I do not choose you, Nikolai. That is my right, and the Blood Moon does not dictate my heart." For an instant, Nikolai simply stared at her, as though trying to absorb the finality of her words. His shoulders sagged, and he let out a ragged breath, the rage in his eyes giving way to a tortured emptiness. Then he averted his gaze, the fight drained from him, as if the old legends and the power of fate had betrayed him at last. Kieran exhaled, relief washing over him in waves, though he kept a vigilant stance. Any sudden move from Nikolai could still be fatal. But the Alpha of Shadowfang, broken and bleeding, made no attempt to rise. He remained on his knees, defiant tears glimmering in his eyes, even if his fury had guttered like a spent torch. In the hush that followed, Ilara became acutely aware of her surroundings. The Shadowfang wolves stood uncertainly, many shifting their feet as if unsure whether to come to their Alpha's aid or accept defeat. Silvercrest warriors, battered but holding their ground, regarded their foes with caution. A single, tense moment stretched, as though the entire cavern was waiting for direction. Kieran placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder, giving her a look that conveyed both relief and caution. He lifted his head to address the gathering. "Shadowfang," he began, his voice resonating with the authority befitting an Alpha. "Your Alpha made a grave error when he abducted one of mine, but we are willing to stand down if you do not raise arms against us again. We do not wish to spill more blood than necessary." Murmurs rippled through the cavern. Though some Shadowfang wolves growled under their breath, many lowered their weapons or shifted back to human form, acknowledging that their leader lay defeated at Silvercrest's feet. Others hung their heads, perhaps realizing the severity of Nikolai's betrayal of fundamental werewolf ethics. Ilara felt a mixture of exhaustion and dizzy relief. The blood moon still glowed high above them, bathing the chamber in its unsettling red glow, but its power felt distant now, as though the immediate threat had passed. The forced bond had been prevented, Nikolai lay vanquished, and Kieran was alive. She whispered a silent thanks to whatever unseen force had guided them to this moment, hoping they would find a path to peace in the aftermath. Slowly, Nikolai shifted on his knees, his gaze sweeping across the ring of his own wolves. He cleared his throat, voice hoarse. "Stand down," he said, each word an effort. "Let them go." Ilara's heart gave a painful lurch at the raw resignation in his voice. Whatever power had driven him had fractured, leaving him hollow. She looked away, unable to reconcile the fleeting pang of pity she felt with the memory of his cruelty. The situation was too complicated to resolve with a single glance, yet it seemed that acceptance of his defeat was the first step toward ending this conflict. Kieran signaled to Jared, who gave a nod, instructing the Silvercrest wolves to loosen their defensive ring and prepare for a controlled withdrawal. A sense of relief mingled with the tension, as they realized they might leave this place with their lives intact and their mission accomplished. Yet none of them let their guard down completely. Ilara stepped away from Nikolai, her mind whirling. She felt the sting of multiple bruises, the lingering ache of nerve violation, and the overwhelming need to escape those claustrophobic tunnels. So much had happened, so much threatened to break her, and yet she remained standing, free to choose her own future. Kieran's presence at her side was a balm to her frayed nerves. She leaned lightly against him for a moment, inhaling the familiar scent of pine and earth that always clung to him. Though she had never spoken of it openly before, the time they had shared within the Silvercrest Pack had ignited a slow, genuine connection in her heart, one unburdened by forced prophecy. Now, as he looked at her with concern shadowing his gaze, she felt that connection intensify. "We should get you out of here," he said softly, slipping an arm around her waist to support her. "You have been through too much." She nodded, her throat too tight to form words. Together they prepared to leave, Jared and the other Silvercrest wolves forming a protective cordon around them. She cast one last glance over her shoulder at Nikolai, who remained on his knees, staring at the ground. The triumphant roars of Shadowfang warriors were nowhere to be heard. In fact, most seemed haunted or pensive, as though they recognized a fundamental fracture in the foundation of their pack. As they moved toward the tunnel that would lead them back to the surface, Nikolai's low voice called after them. "I was not always this way," he muttered, though he did not look up, speaking more to the echoing space than to anyone in particular. "Fate can break a wolf, twist him into something unrecognizable. Perhaps if I had met you under different circumstances." Ilara said nothing. Kieran glanced back at him, but found no words of comfort to offer. There was no erasing the violence, the cruelty, or the terror that Nikolai had unleashed. Some lines, once crossed, left scars that time could not easily mend. Their footsteps echoed as they retraced their path through the winding corridors. The once ominous labyrinth felt different now, the tension easing with each step they took away from the heart of Shadowfang territory. There were minor skirmishes along the corridors, pockets of confused Shadowfang wolves who had not yet gotten the message to stand down, but nothing too large to manage. Each time, Kieran or Jared would growl an order for them to stop, and more often than not, those wolves would drop their aggressive stance once they saw how many of their comrades had already yielded. Eventually, the moist air gave way to a cooler breeze, and the oppressive darkness of the tunnels broke as they neared the surface. A sliver of moonlight, shining red, beckoned them through the final passage. Stepping out into the open forest night felt like a baptism of fresh air for Ilara, who gasped at the sight of tall pines silhouetted against the eerie red glow. Though her body still trembled from the ordeal, she felt closer to freedom under the open sky. She was not the only one relieved. The Silvercrest wolves, many sporting bruises and cuts, took grateful breaths of the crisp night air, glancing around to ensure there were no hidden threats lurking under the canopy. The hours that had passed in that subterranean warren felt like an eternity. As they regrouped, the adrenaline that had fueled them began to wane, replaced by weariness and an acute awareness of their wounds. Kieran stepped up beside Ilara, gazing at her with an earnestness that made her heart clench. Despite the red moon overhead, His eyes held nothing but warmth and gratitude. He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, revealing a faint scratch across her cheek. "Let me see that," he said softly, brushing his thumb across it. "We will have to clean it soon, to avoid infection." Ilara found herself leaning into his touch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice husky with emotion. "For saving me in there." His brows drew together. "I did what any alpha would do for a member of his pack." She wanted to say that it felt like more than that, but the words remained lodged in her throat. Even so, she suspected Kieran sensed it too, the intangible bond that had grown between them amid all the chaos. Maybe it had been present long before this nightmare, but it had been forged to steel in the crucible of crisis. A part of her yearned to reach out and hold him, but the moment felt too raw, too saturated with the memories of blood and fear. They turned to find Jared approaching. He had been assessing their scouts and wounded. "We should get moving," the beta said, a look of relief etched onto his bruised features. "I doubt the Shadowfang wolves will chase us, but I do not want us lingering on their borders. We need to return home and mend." Kieran nodded, beckoning for everyone to form up. A hush had fallen over the forest, as though nature itself sensed the significance of the events that had just transpired. The hush was not entirely peaceful. There remained an undercurrent of worry and tension, a collective awareness that the aftermath of this night was far from resolved, but at least, for now, they had escaped the labyrinth. With measured steps, the Silvercrest wolves withdrew from Shadowfang territory, guided by the faint trail of markers they had left on their way in. A few hours after emerging from the tunnels, the horizon began to shift with the subtle promise of dawn. The blood moon had begun its slow descent, fading in brilliance, its crimson hue lightening to a softer shade. Each minute that passed took them further from the forced fate that had nearly been sealed. By the time they neared Silvercrest's borders, exhaustion clung to every limb. Yet the sight of their own forest, with familiar trails and sentries still posted despite the hour, renewed a sense of hope. Ilara's heart fluttered at the sound of welcoming howls from those who had been anxiously awaiting their return. Though battered, Silvercrest had emerged from Mikolai's stronghold with the most precious prize of all, her freedom. A few medics rushed forward, guiding them to a large communal lodge where injuries could be treated. Wolves peeled off to find cots, blankets, bandages, and water. The hum of relieved conversation replaced the earlier hush of dread. Ilara allowed one of the healers to lead her to a smaller side chamber, where she was told to rest while her wounds were tended. She sank onto a wooden bench, mind buzzing with too many thoughts. It was not long before Kieran arrived, slipping into the chamber with quiet steps. A medic followed him, pressing gently on the wound at his side to stanch the bleeding, but he waved them off once he saw Ilara. "Take care of her first," he insisted, his voice taut with concern. Ilara tried to protest. "I'm not as badly hurt as you. That slash on your ribs. Let me worry about that later," Kieran said, crouching beside her. His eyes flicked to the gash across her forearm and the bruises on her shoulders. "I promised I would bring you home safe." She parted her lips, words tangling in her throat. All the adrenaline that had kept her upright began to fade, and tears she had held back now threatened to spill. She felt the sting of them, and took a shaky breath, fighting to remain composed. "Hey," he said quietly, catching the quiver in her lips. "You are safe now." She could not stop the tears. They rolled down her cheeks, a silent, unstoppable flood of relief and lingering terror. Kieran gently touched the side of her face, his thumb wiping one tear away, an unspoken kindness in his expression. The world around them went momentarily quiet. She was aware of the distant hum of others being treated, the soft instructions of healers, but Kieran's presence overshadowed everything. "I never thought it," she began, her voice breaking. "I never thought that bond with Nikolai could be so strong. That it could almost, He exhaled, a tremor of suppressed emotion coloring his voice. "I know," he said simply. "Fate is a complicated force. We have legends, myths, and prophecies that talk about the blood moon and its power to unite mates. But no matter how potent it might be, it is nothing compared to what we choose in our hearts." She swallowed, the tears slowing. "I just felt so helpless." Kieran lowered his gaze for a moment, wrestling with his own remorse. "I am sorry," he said, voice rough. "I should have protected you from that. When you were taken..." "Stop," she whispered, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "You saved me in the end. You risked everything to bring me back." A charged stillness passed between them. The medic approached, concern evident on their face, but they remained quiet, respectful of the conversation. Carefully, they began to clean the cuts on Ilara's arms, dabbing antiseptic that stung but also brought clarity. Even as she winced at the sensation, she kept her gaze on Kieran. He gave a small, almost tentative smile, though his eyes were still shadowed with worry. "We will talk about it more when you have rested," he said. "Right now, you need to heal." She nodded, but felt the tug of words unsaid, confessions half-formed. This was hardly the place or time for declarations. Still, the weight of the moment pressed on her, and she squeezed his hand, letting him feel her gratitude and trust. A glimmer of understanding passed between them, and he gently squeezed back before allowing the medic to shoo him away so they could tend to his injuries as well. Though many hours of healing and rest lay ahead, Ilara felt an unburdening in her soul. The blood moon had tested them, nearly shackling her to a fate she refused to accept. Yet now she was free, her mind no longer clouded by the dread that she might be forced into Nikolai's claim. She might bear scars, both physical and emotional, but she would face the future on her own terms, surrounded by a pack that had proven their devotion time and again. As her wounds were bandaged, and exhaustion threatened to carry her into a deep sleep, she cast one last glance at Kieran's retreating form. She recognized, with a bittersweet ache, that the bond she felt with him was not the same as the one she had with her pack in general. It was something deeper, resonating in both her wolf nature and her human heart, and it had been forged by choice, by loyalty, and by the fires of adversity. Though the path ahead remained uncertain, she found that it no longer frightened her. The blood moon would fade, the night would pass, and with the coming dawn, she would stand by her Alpha's side, free to embrace a destiny she shaped for herself. It began quietly, a peace that felt fragile after the storm of conflict, as Silvercrest Pack woke to the pale light of dawn. Word of Ilara's rescue from the Shadowfang Pack had spread quickly. Wolves young and old gathered around the main lodge to hear the details whispered in hushed voices, brimming with curiosity and relief. Over cups of strong herbal brews, they discussed the events of the previous night, the infiltration of Nikolai's stronghold, the brutal showdown, the abrupt retreat, and the near-forced bond that had been narrowly averted under the glow of the blood moon. Ilara stirred in her bunk, blinking against the soft rays of early morning sunlight. The relentless ache in her body reminded her that this was no ordinary morning. However, the heaviness in her chest had lightened, buoyed by the realization that she was back in her own territory, among those she loved and trusted. A wave of gratitude washed over her, easing some of the tension that clung to her thoughts. Slowly, she tried to sit up. Her arms protested the movement, but she bit down on her lip, refusing to give in to the soreness. She saw that her bandages had been changed overnight, the wrappings clean and snub against her bruised skin. Someone must have come in to check on her while she slept. Another flicker of warmth touched her chest as she considered how her packmates always looked after each other. She managed to swing her legs over the side of the bunk just as a gentle rap sounded on the wooden door. Before she could call out, the door creaked open, and Jared poked his head in. He offered a weary smile. A day's worth of tension and relief was etched on his face, but a quiet resolve shone through. "Good morning," he said, stepping inside. "How do you feel?" She grimaced, rolling her shoulder experimentally, like I got smashed around in a cavern full of angry wolves. He huffed a soft laugh. "That sounds about right. The healers said you need rest, but also that you could handle some light movement, if you're up to it. Kieran is holding a gathering near the clearing. He wants to address the entire pack about everything that happened." A rush of anticipation sparked in her chest. She had expected that Kieran would debrief everyone, but her own heart pounded at the thought of hearing him speak about the events under the blood moon. She swallowed. "I need to be there," she replied, voice quieter than she intended. "I figured you would say that," Jared said, nodding. "Let me help you." With his support, Ilara rose, biting back a wince. Her knees felt wobbly, but she managed to remain upright. She insisted on walking, not wanting to appear frail before the pack. Her pride still burned hot, determined to show Nikolai had not broken her. They made their way out of the lodge, passing a few wolves milling about in the early morning gloom. Conversations hushed when they saw Ilara. Some dipped their heads in respect or offered murmured words of relief, expressing how grateful they were she had returned. Ilara tried to respond with a faint smile, though her emotions were a jumbled knot. She was touched, yet still processing the trauma of her captivity, uncertain how to respond to so many well-meaning concerns. A short walk led them to the heart of the territory, a wide grassy clearing surrounded by towering pines. Dew clung to the blades of grass, and the sky overhead was tinged with the golden hues of sunrise. Despite the weariness, a subtle tranquility lingered in the crisp morning air. Wolves in human form stood in clusters, speaking in hushed tones. Others lounged on large stones or fallen logs, anticipating Kieran's arrival. When Ilara approached, a soft ripple of acknowledgement traveled through the crowd. She felt eyes upon her, not with pity, but with a deep sense of empathy. The Silvercrest Pack was not a group bound by fear or forced loyalty. They were family. Jared guided her to a spot near the front, close to where Kieran was positioned, talking quietly with several pack elders. She noticed the bandages on his torso, peeking out from beneath his shirt, and her chest tightened at the sight of the bruises on his forearms. He still looked every bit the resolute Alpha, but she knew how badly he was hurting under that confident exterior. He caught sight of her, and a flash of warmth crossed his face, quickly tempered by a hint of concern. As the crowd settled, he lifted a hand in greeting and turned to address them. "My friends," Kieran began, his voice carrying gently, but firmly. "We have survived a night that tested both our strength and our unity. As many of you know by now, the Shadowfang Pack, led by Nikolai, invaded our territory and took Ilara captive. We pursued them into their underground stronghold and freed her. But there is more to tell." A hush fell over the gathering. Kieran recounted the events, how Shadowfang slipped through the borders, the battle in the clearing, and Ilara's abduction. He spoke of the labyrinth beneath the mountains, the fearsome confrontation with Nikolai, and the forced bond Nikolai tried to claim under the blood moon. Gasps and growls of indignation arose from the listeners, many bristling at the mere thought of a forced mating ritual. Ilara felt uneasy standing in front of everyone with the knowledge that they were hearing how close she came to being claimed against her will. Her cheeks flushed, and she instinctively cast her gaze downward. But then she realized that these wolves, her family, deserved to know the whole truth, not just the sanitized version. Shame would not serve her. Instead, she lifted her chin, meeting the eyes of those who stared in horror and sympathy. Kieran's voice softened. Ilara thought bravely, even in captivity, resisting the bond with all her strength. If not for her own defiance, and the determination of our pack to see one of our own returned safely, Nikolai might have succeeded in forging a link under the blood moon. But she is here, free and unbroken, because we faced the darkness together. A stirring of pride rippled through the crowd. Ilara felt a swell of emotion that threatened to spill from her eyes. She saw heads nodding, younger wolves looking at her with admiration, older pack members shaking their heads in grim understanding of how harrowing her experience must have been. Kieran continued, voice resonant with conviction. We do not seek further conflict with Shadowfang. Nor do we condone any vigilante attacks. That path leads only to more tragedy. Nikolai's defeat was enough to show that any future hostility from them will be met with unyielding defense. But we, as Silvercrest, will not become aggressors. We will heal, rebuild, and stand vigilant. He paused, letting those words settle, then shifted his gaze to Ilara. A gentle current of expectation moved through the crowd. Some parted to give her a clearer path, anticipating she might want to speak. She swallowed hard, nerves fluttering in her stomach. Normally, she would leave such oratory to Kieran or Jared, content to remain in the background. But after what she had endured, and how narrowly she escaped a fate she never wanted, it felt important to share her voice. She stepped forward, wincing slightly at the soreness in her muscles, and the pack fell silent. Struggling to find the right words, she took a measured breath. I want to thank you, she said, her voice quiet but earnest. Every single one of you who fought to save me, and those who prayed for me, kept watch, or offered support in any way. A wave of nods and soft murmurs traveled through the crowd. Ilara cleared her throat, pressing on. Nikolai insisted that fate dictated we were mates, that the blood moon sanctioned this bond he tried to force on me. For a moment, her voice cracked, and she blinked quickly. I feared it might be true, that I would have no choice, but I realized something that night. Fate might influence our paths, might even reveal connections we cannot fully explain, but fate does not override our right to choose how we live and who we bond with. A sense of unity swelled around her, a shared affirmation that soared beyond the words being spoken. Some packmates exchanged glances and nodded, seeming to draw courage from her testimony. An older she-wolf, with gray streaks in her hair, gently placed a hand over her heart, looking at Ilara with tears in her eyes. Ilara added, I choose Silvercrest. I choose to remain here and build a future that we shape on our own terms, not by fear or cruelty, but by compassion and strength. Spontaneous applause broke out, mingled with the distinctive throaty growls of affirmation that only a pack of wolves could produce. It was not a celebration of triumph over a rival pack as much as it was a celebration of freedom, of the pack's collective dedication to each other, and the relief that they had not lost one of their own. Ilara felt a flood of gratitude, an overwhelming sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She glanced at Kieran and found him watching her, a soft, reflective pride in his eyes that made her heartbeat quicken. Under that gaze, it was hard to ignore the new swirl of emotions she felt for him, complicated, tender, and intense. He gave a small incline of his head, signaling the conclusion of the gathering. Wolves began to disperse, some going to check on the wounded, others returning to their daily responsibilities, albeit with a renewed sense of caution. Jared approached Ilara, a knowing grin on his face. "You surprised me," he said quietly, his voice laced with genuine warmth. "I didn't expect you to speak in front of everyone like that. You did well." She brushed a hand through her hair, still feeling the aftershocks of adrenaline. "I usually prefer the quiet approach, but sometimes words need to be said." He reached out, gently squeezing her shoulder. "I'm glad you're back, Ilara. We all are." She nodded, swallowing the lump of emotion in her throat. As Jared moved away, a line of younger pack members encircled her, each offering small tokens of comfort, an herbal tonic, a warm blanket, a gentle hug, or a pat on the shoulder. The outpouring of kindness both humbled her and reminded her that not every bond in life was shaped by cosmic destiny. Some bonds were built through everyday moments of empathy and shared purpose. Eventually, the crowd thinned, drifting into the morning light. Ilara noticed Kieran standing by the edge of the clearing, speaking in low tones with Everett and another tracker. She could see from his intense expression that they were likely discussing border security and future reconnaissance. Something about his posture, his broad shoulders drawn taut, the slight furrow in his brow, told her he carried a heavy weight of responsibility. She felt drawn to him, an unspoken impulse nudging her forward. Quietly, she navigated across the clearing until she was within earshot. Everett bowed his head in deference. "Alpha," he said, "will set up additional patrols along the eastern border." Kieran nodded. "Thank you. Take as many as you need, but keep enough for rotating shifts. Our pack is weary, but we can't afford to be careless." Everett acknowledged Ilara with a kind greeting, then slipped away, leaving her alone with Kieran. She could not quite read the look in his eyes. His earlier intensity seemed tempered by relief, yet she sensed an undercurrent of introspection. "How are you feeling?" he asked, scanning her face. Her lips quirked in a small, wry smile. "Better than last night, which is saying a lot." He returned her smile, but it did not quite erase the tension in his features. A breeze rustled the branches above, stirring the pungent scent of pine. They stood there in the dappled sunlight, words hanging unspoken between them. Finally, Kieran sighed, gaze drifting to the edge of the forest. This conflict with Shadowfang might not be fully over. Nikolai may be weakened, possibly even unfit to lead, but that doesn't mean a new, more vengeful Alpha won't emerge, or that Nikolai himself won't try Ba. Something desperate. Ilara frowned. She had hoped the standoff in the cavern would be enough to deter Shadowfang for a good while. But Kieran was right. Power vacuums in werewolf territories were dangerous, and there was no telling how the pack members would react once they recovered from the shock of Nikolai's defeat. "We'll be ready," she said, injecting as much confidence into her voice as she could muster. He nodded, though his shoulders remained taut. "We will, but I am also worried about you." A gentle flush crept into her cheeks. She turned to look at him, and in the golden morning light, she saw not just a protective Alpha, but a man who had laid everything on the line to keep her safe. The memory of him barreling into Nikolai at the last second flickered through her thoughts. "I'll recover," she said softly. "You risked so much, Kieran. I can never repay that." He gave a low chuckle, though it held a hint of bitterness. I should never have allowed you to be taken in the first place. She bristled, stepping closer. That wasn't your fault. Nikolai surprised all of us, and no one could have known how far he'd go. His eyes wandered her face. Still, as Alpha, it is my responsibility to keep my pack safe. Failing that, you didn't fail, she interrupted, her voice shaking with emotion. We're both still here. That's proof enough that you did not fail. For a moment, they stood in quiet confrontation, her eyes fierce, his filled with self-reproach. Then something shifted, some barrier of pretense falling away, leaving a raw honesty in its wake. Kieran let out a slow breath, as though surrendering to the weight of truth. Ilara, he began, voice low. When I fought Nikolai, it was not just because you're a member of my pack. It was for a more personal reason as well. Her breath caught. She had sensed there was more to their connection, but hearing him say it out loud made her heart flutter with anticipation and a tiny thread of anxiety. She tried to speak, but words deserted her. He lifted a hand, gently tracing a spot on her temple where a faint bruise remained. We have known each other for a while, he continued, carefully measuring each syllable. You've trained with me, argued with me, proven yourself loyal to Silvercrest. Somewhere along the way, I realized that you mean more to me than just another packmate. It's not an Alpha's duty to put a single member above the good of the pack, but in your case, I couldn't bear the thought of losing you, not just because it would hurt the pack, but because it would break something inside me. Her chest felt tight, like a coil of energy had wound around her ribs. She read the vulnerability in his posture, the way his fingers trembled slightly against her skin. I feel it too, she whispered, forcing the words out. It's not a forced bond, and it might not be cosmic destiny, but it's real to me. When Nikolai threatened to take me away, the only thing that kept me strong was knowing you were out there, coming for me. A wave of relief and warmth passed between them. He closed the distance, though he did not wrap her in an embrace, as though unsure if she would welcome the contact. She, however, lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. A gentle breeze ruffled the tips of his hair, sending a soft pine fragrance her way. Timidly, he raised a hand to her cheek, and she leaned into his touch. It felt worlds different from Nikolai's grasp. This was gentle, chosen, and filled with respect rather than possession. In that quiet glade, with the morning sun casting streaks of gold through the conifers, the unspoken bond they had been dancing around found its shape. It was not mandated by the blood moon or any ancient prophecy. It was forged by shared trials, mutual reliance, and the quiet accumulation of daily moments that wove a deeper tapestry than fate alone could ever manage. Are you sure? Kieran asked, his breath a soft exhalation that brushed her forehead. I don't want to push you, after what you've been through. She nodded, tears pricking her eyes for the 100th time in 24 hours. I choose you, she said, voice trembling with honesty. If you'll have me. A subtle smile touched his lips, and his eyes shone with a light she had never seen before. Always, he whispered. Before she could respond, he leaned forward, capturing her lips in a gentle, hesitant kiss that tasted of relief, lingering sorrow, and hope. The world around them seemed to shift into sole focus. The turmoil of the Shadowfang battle, the fear of forced bonds, the chaotic swirl of fate under the blood moon, all receded for a single, precious moment. When they drew apart, a flush warmed her cheeks, but she felt lighter, as though a burden had slipped away. She noticed a few lingering packmates in the distance, discreetly averting their eyes or pretending to be engrossed in conversation. Word would spread, inevitably, but she did not mind. If anything, she wanted them to know that her heart found its own path, free of any forced claim. Kieran angled his head, forehead lightly brushing hers. "I don't know what the future holds," he murmured, especially with the possibility that Shadowfang might challenge us again. "But I do know that I want us to face whatever comes next together." Ilara's throat tightened, but she managed a nod, placing her palm against the center of his chest, feeling the steady drumbeat of his heart. "We will," she said simply, "and we'll do it on our own terms." A swirl of possibilities stretched before them, confrontations with any newly emboldened Shadowfang wolves, the rebuilding of alliances frayed by the tension, and the subtle shift in Silvercrest's own structure now that their Alpha had privately chosen a partner, one not fated by the supernatural forces, but by choice. A lot could change, but Ilara no longer feared the unknown the way she once did. Not when she could meet it side by side with Kieran. For the rest of that day, the pack moved forward in a steady rhythm of healing and watchfulness. Scouts reported no immediate retaliation from Shadowfang territory, no suspicious movements near the borders. Maybe speculated that Nikolai, once he recovered from his injuries, might be too humiliated or broken to strike again anytime soon. Others worried he might nurse a bitter grudge, fueling the impetus for a future attack. The elders counseled caution, reminding everyone that trust had to be earned, not assumed. Ilara and Kieran remained busy, tending to the wounded and helping with tasks that needed an Alpha's oversight. In stolen moments, they allowed themselves a brief glance or a fleeting brush of hands, small gestures that conveyed a warmth and comfort that only deepened over time. Neither spoke loudly about the change in their relationship, but the pack sensed it. Soft grins and gentle teases became the norm whenever they were spotted together, though no one openly challenged or questioned it. Silvercrest was built on loyalty and acceptance, and if their Alpha found happiness with one who had proven her worth, they would celebrate rather than protest. As the days slipped by, Ilara regained her strength, practicing light drills with Jared to keep her reflexes sharp. The bruises on her arms and torso faded to pale smudges, and her muscles no longer screamed in protest at every movement. Each night, she found herself reflecting on the traumatic memories of the labyrinth, sometimes jolting awake from nightmares. Yet she always awoke in her own territory, under the gentle glow of the moon that was no longer stained with blood. Gradually healing replaced trauma, the scars transforming into a reminder of how far she had come. At times she wondered about Nikolai, whether he still nursed delusions of forging a bond that did not exist, or whether defeat had shattered something irreparable in him. Rumors trickled in from travelers in the region, hinting that Shadowfang had descended into internal strife, some wolves wanting a new Alpha entirely, others clinging to the old ways. No one could say if Nikolai would hold power much longer. A small part of Ilara felt pity for him, though she could not condone what he had tried to do. Fate was a complex tapestry, and perhaps Nikolai had fallen victim to it, letting obsession and desperation swallow his moral compass. But that was not her battle anymore. She had chosen her path, and it led away from the darkness of forced claims. It guided her into the light of a future shaped by choice, courage, and love. As she strolled through the forested paths of Silvercrest one evening, she felt Kieran's presence beside her, the warmth of his arm as they walked shoulder to shoulder. The sky overhead was soft with twilight, flecked with the first bright stars. The memory of the blood moon felt like a distant dream, a time when cosmic forces tried to overshadow free will and nearly succeeded. Kieran paused by a small stream, the water reflecting the pastel hues of the sunset. He turned to Ilara, his gaze contemplative. "You know," he said, his voice low and steady, "I never planned on taking a mate, or at least not any time soon. My focus was on leading the pack, making sure everyone was safe and provided for. But you changed that. You made me realize that even an alpha can find balance between duty and personal happiness." She smiled softly, lacing her fingers with his. "Duty does not vanish when you open yourself to someone," she replied. "It might even make you stronger. At least, that's what I believe." He squeezed her hand, eyes reflecting the gentle light. "That's what I believe now, too," he whispered. Then, with that understated tenderness that had woven them together from the start, he leaned in and kissed her. This time, there was no audience of worried pack members, no looming threat of battle. It was quiet, intimate, and real. In that moment, Ilara's mind wandered to the countless stories she had heard growing up, tales of alphas who discovered their mates in grand revelations of cosmic fate, of love forged by mystical energies that no one fully understood. Yet here she stood, in a humble clearing by a trickling stream, choosing someone who had fought for her, not because of some predestined force, but because he cared enough to put her freedom above everything else. It was messy, it was full of scars and memories of near tragedy, but it was undeniably theirs. When the kiss ended, she rested her forehead against his shoulder, content in the quiet rustle of leaves and the soft call of a distant owl. The darkness of the forest no longer felt threatening. It felt alive, filled with possibility. They strolled back to the pack settlement as the stars came out in earnest. Laughter and murmured conversations drifted through the crisp air. Wolves in both human and shifted forms passed them, some pausing to greet them with warm smiles or a respectful nod. Though Ilara was still known primarily for her resilience in the face of captivity, she suspected it would not be long before she became known for something else. The strength of her bond with Kieran, built not on forced fate, but a mutual promise of loyalty and love. In the following weeks, the sense of normalcy returned to Silvercrest. Patrols remained vigilant, but life moved on. Pup training sessions were held each morning. Older wolves tended to farmland and supplies, while scouts came and went, sharing information on regional pack dynamics. The scars from the Shadowfang incident began to fade, both literally and figuratively. Ilara helped with daily tasks, carrying out her duties, and sometimes working alongside the healers who had saved her from infection and exhaustion. In doing so, she formed deeper connections with packmates who admired her fortitude. When the next full moon rose, its light was pure silver, free of any crimson stain. A small ceremony was held in the clearing, one that Kieran arranged in quiet consultation with the elders. It was not a grand spectacle of ancient rites, but a modest gathering to acknowledge Ilara's return and reaffirm the bonds within Silvercrest. The older wolves chanted blessings over the pack, and Jared recited a vow of unity, swearing that if danger came again, they would face it as one. At the culmination of the ceremony, Kieran stepped forward, meeting Ilara's gaze. Though no formal announcements were made about them as a couple, the shared look between them spoke volumes. The pack needed no elaborate declarations. They could see the mutual respect and affection. When the chanting ended, the two of them linked hands, and an uproar of approving howls and cheers erupted. It was a moment of joyful kinship, a testament that while the notion of fate remained part of werewolf lore, it was choice that truly bound hearts. Later that night, under the silvery glow of a peaceful moon, Ilara and Kieran strolled to the crest of a small hill that overlooked the heart of their territory. From there, they could see the flickering lights of campfires, the cozy shapes of dwellings, and the silhouettes of patrolling wolves along the perimeter. The air carried the scent of pine, damp earth, and a hint of wood smoke. Crickets hummed in the underbrush, and a mild breeze whispered through the treetops. Kieran paused, tilting his head skyward. The moon hung above them, radiant and unblemished, a gentle guardian rather than an omen of blood. Elara moved close, sliding her arm around his. He slipped a hand around her waist, drawing her nearer, and for a few lingering moments they simply stood in contented silence. "Look at our home," Elara finally said, voice hushed. "After everything, it still feels so peaceful." He nodded, glancing at her with a quiet smile. "It's ours to protect, to cherish. We were tested by the blood moon, by the false bond Nikolai tried to force, but we came out stronger. Not just you and I, but the whole pack." She tightened her hold on him. "Yes," she agreed, her breath hitching with warmth. "And no matter what threats come our way, we'll face them together." In that soft hush of moonlight, with the forest wrapped in a tranquil hush, they kissed. It was a promise, unburdened by cosmic chains or shadowed rituals, a testament to the power of free will and unwavering devotion. For all the complexities that defined their world, the rivalries, the legends, the possibility of violence, this was a moment of pure, simple truth. Elara knew that in the future she might still sense the faint echoes of that jolt she once felt when Nikolai claimed they were fated mates. Some scars never truly vanished, but she also knew that any cosmic thread was no match for the bond forged by choice. It was her heart that guided her, and it found its home in Kieran's steadfast loyalty. Fate had tried to tie her to the enemy, but her heart chose another. In that final acceptance, she discovered freedom was not about running from destiny, it was about forging her own path. And in the quiet hush of Silvercrest's forest, with a true partner by her side, Elara stepped into that path, unafraid of what the next dawn might bring.